Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun,
Hello, hello.
who also goes by Sam, and we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
We launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. In today's episode, we want to spend some time talk about perspectives. Essentially, what do you care about as whom? With the subject of matcha, of course, and we all care about slightly and sometimes very different things.
Yeah, or even just at the vendor level. And we're going to actually, for the sake of this podcast, we're going to talk about it more about the positioning of the vendor. So the person who's actually doing the selling. And they can have very different values. And different companies position their sourcing philosophies and their products in very different ways. And these philosophies come in many different flavors. And it's not what they say in their mission statement. It's not what they say they care about necessarily. We all care about many different things, such as the farmers, such as consumer preference, such as sustainability, and
Environment.
the environment, giving things at a good price, promoting a traditional or heritage product. Everyone cares about these things. But it's where you make compromises where your values really shine. It is what you actually care about, which we wanted to focus on. We've recently received some negative feedback,
Criticism.
some criticism, and it made us do quite a bit of reflecting. And some of them we thought we were fair, and some of them we thought were very unfair. And we're not someone to openly complain publicly, and we definitely don't want to quote unquote punch down on anyone who's criticizing us now that we have a platform. But we had a hard time understanding some of the perspectives. And we realized that all of the toxicity in the comment section, deep on Reddit, and within the broader internet community that celebrates matcha, all stems from the fact that we care about different things. And we express that in where we draw the line on making compromises. So I'll give a very specific example. If your primary objective as a company or as a vendor or even as a consumer is to support traditional small Japanese tea farmers, and someone develops fantastic matcha in South Korea. They're doing Hanzu shading, they've imported Asahi cultivar, everything is handpicked. They're producing a fantastic product, and you have the opportunity to buy some and to sell it. If your true mission is to help Japanese small farmers, that's a compromise you're probably not willing to make. But if you're a product focused company trying to source the best possible tasting matcha, or some people argue that it can't be matcha unless it's grown in Japan, but for the case of this argument, let's call it matcha grown in Korea. If you're product focused and your goal is to source the best, then you should have no problem making that compromise.
Very true.
And you have all of these toxic comment threads, so accusing someone of cultural appropriation or accusing someone of using first harvest matcha for lattes, and now there's not enough for tea ceremony practitioners. But the person using it for a latte and the vendor selling first harvest matcha to them might have different values, making different compromises than you are as a tea ceremony practitioner. And we all have to stack rank these things.
I mean, this is a very extreme example, but a more common dilemma also happens within Japan. You can have very product focused, very domestic market focused company trying to really stock their portfolio with a lot of these very ultra umami bomb matcha, which really cannot be created without mountains of fertilizers and pesticides. It's really that's the reality. But on the other hand, if you care about the environment and sustainability, and you want to move to a more organic way of farming, more sustainable way of farming, using less pesticides and less fertilizers, then naturally you will end up getting a more bitter and more astringent tea. And with the domestic standard of judging a matcha, that will inevitably falling into a inferior quality bucket.
I mean, if you really care about the environment, that's a compromise that you're probably willing to make. You'll go to a place that's doing fantastic organic farming and source some things from there. And naturally, when you do organic farming, it means you're not using pesticides, which means you have to use less fertilizer because fertilizer contains nitrogen. Everything loves nitrogen. It attracts pests. So there's a cycle, and it's a compromise that's being made. Now, people who really focus on just quality of the product and things that are going to taste very good, usually don't source organic matcha. It almost always tastes worse and more bitter. And also, when you're not using a lot of pesticides, the plant needs to compensate for that lack of pesticides and basically produce its own, both caffeine and some other compounds,
Catechins.
catechins, all sorts of other things that will deter insects and various pests. So there's all sorts of things that the plant will adapt to naturally because you do that.
Mhm.
And also, honestly, if you really care about like the environment and tea, you maybe shouldn't be consuming like really industrial matcha at all. If you look at agriculture and tea agriculture in Japan compared to a lot of other tea producing regions in the world, it is incredibly industrialized. When you think about these gigantic fields that you see in these beautiful pictures, like in Shizuoka with Mount Fuji behind it, or in Kagoshima, it's all a monocrop. It's a big monocrop of genetically identical plants with very little genetic plant diversity, with tons of nitrogen pumped into the soil, sprayed, that auto harvested. It is not what we would consider as natural farming, or something that if you really care about biodiversity, that you would want to support. Like it's much more similar to like industrial chickens in a gigantic shed, right? Obviously, there's not as much animal suffering going on. But if that is what you care about, then that's a compromise that you should make. And maybe you should only drink the seed propagated, meaning you have large amounts of plant to plant genetic diversity, where they're growing it in a natural environment, not this gigantic monoculture, but there are also some potentially other crops or trees or various shrubs in between, and much more sustainable methods. Typically, they're quite a bit more expensive because they need to be hand picked because you can't have these big automatic pickers because they're not in these big perfect rows. Typically, they require natural fertilizer, which is much more expensive than synthetic fertilizer. These compromises are important because it reflects what we care about as consumers and as different businesses. And might I say, it is a very good thing that we have businesses caring about these different topics.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, like, thank God for all those farmers in Shizuoka and Kagoshima figure out this way of producing large amount of consistently tasty matcha out there to supply the world. Like, without them, like, there won't be enough matcha. They're already like we have a matcha shortage, but like, imagine like without Kagoshima and Shizuoka, probably this shortage will be like really it will happen probably 10 years ago already.
Yeah, and let's move to a different extreme. Let's say you're a cafe owner, uh, anywhere in the world, and your goal is to really do justice to your employees. You're a company, you're a business, and you're trying to make the best product you can. But really, your goal is to make the community that you're in thrive, and to make sure that your employees have a good living wage, who are your baristas, and can really make a career out of this thing, right? And you're like over here in this corner of the world listening to someone else preach to you that these gigantic monocultures are producing a very industrial product, and that you should just do the natural thing. And you're over here thinking, like, I can't spend 4 times more on this product.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's not enough of that product in the world to to f- to,
Anyway,
to
so
give matcha to everybody.
yeah.
It's not a scalable solution. Like, yeah, good for you paying 4 times more. I'm glad you can afford it, but I got 15 employees to take care of. So your values are reflected in the compromise that you're making. And of course, they probably care about the environment. But in the stack rank of things that they care about, it's relatively lower. So, really good, fine example. And, we also are very guilty of like hating on something like industrial scale Kagoshima first flush organic matcha that's milled on a ball mill. And typically, the lens that we're filtering it through is a product or consumer focused lens, like really focusing on like flavor expression that can come out of this plant that are interesting and unique and terroir expressive and things that we like to drink. But it's very much filtered through like a specialty product lens. And the compromises that we're making there is that we're ignoring like really good solutions for small businesses in like B2B environments for people supplying other businesses with matcha. We're ignoring, and we might be ignoring part of the consumer focused lens who might not really care about high end matcha and just wants the nice matcha flavor for their bubble tea. So that's, I think, the root of where all of this conflict is, where people are making judgments on others. And you really have to think about what you care about.
Yeah, It's really who you are by the end of the day that defines you, what you care about. You have tea practitioners making criticisms on cafes or bubble tea shops consuming too much matcha. Is like a orchestra concert team making criticisms about a pop group using too much of the stage time of a stadium. They're essentially two very different things for two very different audiences.
And filtered through two very different sets of stack rank priorities because you cannot care about the environment or health and wellness or the ceremony and culture, like the farmers themselves, the product itself, matcha businesses, at various points in the value chain, and the consumer all in the same breath. You have to make compromises, and that is what you care about, is where you make compromises. So, for example, some people might hate on these quote unquote Chinese bamboo chasens because we're not supporting Takayama chasens or people in Nara making chasens, and that we need to support these traditional crafts. And it turns out that from purely a small business perspective, people who source these things have actually gotten a little bit screwed. These producers cannot keep up. There are not enough handmade Takayama chasens in the world to meet the current demand. And wait lists are huge. And typically, when the vendors that sell them get them, right, they get like, I don't know, 40 at a time. Like, it's not very much. And it's like having an inconsistent supplier to build a business on top of is hard if you're trying to do this. And if you're truly consumer focused, not all consumers need a $50 handmade chasen. And by the way, the ones from China that are much cheaper and much more available are actually handmade. I don't know why everyone thinks and calls them machine made. They're not. They're way too intricate for a machine to be made. It just so happens that when you have someone in a factory in China where a really decent lunch costs like $1, of course you can charge less for that product than when a grand master sitting in the middle of like Takayama, who like probably is driving a nice car, right? Like it's very different labor requirements. Are the Takayama chasens better? Yes. They're more thoughtful, they're more heritage, the bamboo is higher quality, and from a structural and functional perspective, like it's subtle, but they are definitely better. Who is going to notice that difference? I don't know. It's a very small group of consumers. So like compromises like that.
I mean, as long as the Chinese bamboo is not acid wash, I don't see a problem with them being used every day in a cafe and gets disposed like in 3 or 7 days because it's really abused use, and which is the reality of the modern usage of utensils in the modern cafe. Takayama chasens were meant for be used in a tea ceremony, and ironically, it was a disposable item at the time. They were meant to be used only once or twice. But now they get used every day. And if you are trying to use that in a modern consumption scenario, which is like, I don't know, 30 times, 50 times a day, like that is really not what it was meant for. And using, a cheaper and more economical replacement, there's really no problem with that.
And I think people can hold different perspectives at different times because we've actually hated. I remember on this podcast criticizing someone who was advocating for starting authentic in your practice. And part of what they were advocating for is whisking matcha in a chawan with a bamboo chasen. And I remember looking at the chasen and realizing this is 100% not made in Japan, handmade in Japan. Like this is absolutely industrial quality coming from China, which is decent, but like I can tell that it's not by looking at the details. And I criticized them, right? And part of the root of the criticism was I was putting Japanese ceremony and culture first. I was filtering it through that lens. And I was filtering through that lens because that was what I was primed to do. When you're telling someone to start authentic and to do things the way they've been traditionally done in Japan, right? You're trying to profit off of someone else's culture, but not directly supporting it in any way by selling a product that's produced somewhere else. None of that money circles back. So that's the primary effect. But actually, there's also secondary effects to all of this. Everyone needs an intro chasen. Very few beginners should ever start with the Takayama chasen. So having a bunch of people have these cheaper Chinese made cha which you can buy retail for 10, 15, 20 US dollars, right? That's going to create the market that then realize, oh, you know what? I kind of want an upgrade. I really like this matcha thing. I'm enjoying this every morning. I want an artisanal product. I'm going to go out and buy a really nice raku bowl and support these makers making these $50 cha.
Yeah, here's an interesting point. Like, if you really care about, the spread of and the preservation of Japanese traditional culture, you would want to see more people want to practice, whisking matcha with a chasen. And do you want to see your very expensive chasen being used everywhere in the world, like by all these beginners trying to, really brute force using that and scraping the bottom of the teapot? Like, this is really the same logic with, like all of these quote unquote overconsumption of ceremonial matcha. It's the same thing. Words are getting spread, culture are getting spread, people are getting interested, people naturally want to learn more and want the best. But without a lower tier replacement to compensate, like, and stigmatizing and criticizing people for using a lower replacement, I think that's not going to do any good by any means.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Mm.
And even like another good example of a lot of conflict and something that we've talked about before are these poetically named matcha blends. Like we took the position in an opinion piece that we wrote, are poetic matcha names harmful? You can go back and listen to that if you haven't for more context. If you're taking a ceremonial or cultural perspective and placing it first, well, of course they're good. It's like a huge legacy of Japan. Like if you go to Marukyu, right? It's a 300-year-old company, something like that, or maybe it's even older. It's like 17 something, early 1700s. Spreading that culture all over the world, like great. Like if that's your primary objective, but if your primary objective is to help consumers build preferences so that they can discover what they like and dislike based on the specialty principles of the product, such as like what cultivar it was from, where it was grown, how it was processed, it is harmful. So, in that stance, we were putting the consumer above the ceremony and culture. And that offends some people sometimes.
Mm.
We got some hate mail recently saying, who are we? We're not Japanese speakers. We haven't lived in Japan. Why are we belittling and slandering Japanese tea ceremony? We need to come in with a lot more respect and show reverence to this art because that's what created matcha in the first place. And they're right. They're totally right if you're putting ceremony and culture first.
And by no means we want to disrespect, such culture. Like, thank God tea ceremony exists so that, the culture of matcha got preserved over the course of time. And so are all these art related to Chanoyu. The very reason why a lot of these matcha got their poetic names was their relationship with traditional Japanese literatures and their culture. And that was part of the appreciation or the theme setting progress or procedure during a Chanoyu ceremony. And of course, it makes sense in a Chanoyu or tea ceremony context. It doesn't make sense for matcha as a specialty product context.
Yeah. But they're also wrong within the same spirit of what they're advocating for because people are naturally interested in different things. And I'm sorry, tea ceremony should not be the entry point for the majority of consumers. Maybe they like at the surface level like it, but like if you attend enough of these things and learn enough about, it is not like the path to actually learn about this drink. It is much, much deeper and philosophical. It's actually like pseudo spiritual and like quasi religious with all the Buddhism philosophies and Zen really closely linked with a lot of the modern day schools. And of course, there's different schools that have slightly different philosophies, but it is way deeper than most people realize. It has really nothing to do with matcha. But spreading matcha and the love for matcha as a product, as a consumer, as a flavor that people like for various reasons, especially the specialty principles, where it's from, how it was grown, supporting farmers, et cetera, that is a much larger potential market, right? There's a pretty definite ceiling on the number of people that are actually going to be interested in tea ceremony and Chanoyu and actually becoming a student long term. But the ceiling for matcha as a specialty product is huge. It's potentially billions of consumers. naturally, a subsegment of those consumers will then become interested in learning the more traditional aspects of Chanayu and better understanding where this product came from historically. We're creating another entry point. We're creating another marketing funnel for Chanayu practitioners.
Yeah, and from a perspective point of view, if you're a tea farmer, if you're a tea maker in Japan, of course, this is going to be the future that you want to see, like a much larger market out there in the world versus a very confined domestic market that only use matcha for a very specific purpose.
Yeah. So people, especially in their arguments, can be both right and wrong at the same time, depending on whether or not you're looking at primary effects or secondary effects, or depending on how you stack rank your priorities, which is what you ultimately care about. And I think that's sort of the root of where a lot of this toxicity comes from. It's very painful, Zongjun, right?
Yeah, it's I think just misalignment of expectation and what they essentially rooting for. It's context specific, and people frequently do not understand other people's context, which is totally fine.
Yeah.
That's the reality of the internet.
Well, actually, that's exactly what it is. People do not understand other people's context.
Yeah.
It's the perfect encapsulation of it. People who don't do transparent label don't care about matcha farmers. If you're not sharing who you're sourcing from, that is lower on the stack rank than convenient opacity or selling a very cheap product or trying to wrap your brand in mystery and mysticism that we are seeing. If you really care about the matcha farmers, you be very transparent. You help them create brands for themselves. Look at Suji-san. Suji-san didn't get famous by himself necessarily. I mean, he won lots of awards within Japan and very famous within the domestic market. But the only reason we know about him is from Kettle, is from Johnny Matcha, is from Mark from Oika, it's from Pop in Thailand with Kodo Tea Space. It's people who source this product and tell their story. It's very similar to how like wine producers get very famous. The sommeliers talk about them. We are talking about them. There's stories to be told. And like they lift up these farmers to the point where they have a lot more control over their livelihoods. And now someone like him has the ability to make a lot more investments to raise quality and to increase volume so that more of us have a product that's coming from him versus a large traditional blend house or from a gigantic mass agriculture operation somewhere else in Japan or even in China. So it's if you really care about the farmers and put them first, that's what you're doing.
Yeah, it's the reality. Or if you are a traditional house and you continue to make this product with all of these historical significance, that's fine. Like this culture needs you to continue to exist into the future. And it will be benefit from more people wanting to drink and try and be interested in matcha and Japanese culture.
Yeah. And there's sometimes a lot of irony too in a lot of this marketing. A lot of vendors will call matcha like very environmental and like, it's very natural. You're drinking this leaf and you're drinking the whole leaf. And like if you learn anything about tea farming in other places, matcha is literally like one of the most unnatural forms of tea cultivation that there are.
Yeah, or like not just tea, agricultural cultivation. Even
It's
if you compare to like grapes and coffee, other beverage category, like matcha is hyper engineered.
Yeah, it's shaded and like plants have like natural rhythms. Just like we have circadian rhythms, plants have natural rhythms that have a lot to do with the light and the sun. When you shade it, it's very hard on the plants.
Basically suffocating the plant. Like, one thing that really surprised me, like Ryan and I both came from a Kung Fu, like Chinese tea education background. And one thing that really caught me off guard is that when farmers tell me that these tea plants they have a lifespan, they will die in
Yeah.
like 30 or 40 years. And then before, at the end of their life cycle, they will just basically kill the plant and replace it with new bushes.
Yeah, they don't live very long.
Yeah, and that's not the case for a lot of tea growing in Korea and China.
Yeah, where it's much more biodiverse. We were just in Anhui province, checking out a bunch of rural tea farms there. I'm just out of our own personal interest because we're really into Chinese tea as well. And like the biodiversity is insane. They were like, yeah, we planted these evergreens here. We planted this other camellia plant here. And we actually noticed that like a lot of the tea tastes different when it's by all these other plants. It's not just this big,
Yeah,
giant
yeah.
mass agriculture
Yeah,
thing.
you see the same thing happening in Yunnan, like different, vegetations in different mountains who actually have a pretty obvious impact on the tea bush. And like those are not tea bush, they are tea trees. Like they live for hundreds of years and they're part of the forest.
Yeah.
That's not something that you would see easily in Japan. They do exist in Japan, just in much smaller quantity.
And we were asking some of these farmers in Huangshan, like how long do your green tea, the bushes that you use for green tea, how long do they live? Because we've been very Japanese focused, obviously, for a while, so it was like top of mind for us. And they were like, they don't die.
What are you talking
Oh,
about?
yeah.
They don't die.
We were like very much in a very different mindset.
Yeah, yeah,
We were like, oh, whoa, yeah.
yeah. Right. You're right.
And actually, we've recently been translating some Japanese literature about shading because we're really a lot more interested in that process from an agricultural perspective.
And the practice and shading and its stress on plants do get talked about in all these Japanese literatures too. Like, well aware within the industry.
And something that Ian from Unomi has talked about too is that some of the very large players in Japan who are buying up lots or leasing land from smaller tea farmers and kind of plugging it into their operations are shading now into the fourth harvest. Right, that's like forcing a tea plant to run a marathon 4 times in a row.
Yeah.
Because when you do the shade cultivation, you're depriving it of nutrients. Photosynthesis matters. That's why all the best tea producers in Japan from a product perspective are only shading once a year to allow a full year of recovery for that plant. And some people do 2 harvests, so there's a little more recovery time, but it can be driven into 3 or 4. And those plants do not live very long. And also, if you wean them off of fertilizer, a lot of these plants are addicted to fertilizer. There's an episode deep in the archives from Ricardo's podcast, My Japanese Green Tea Podcast, on organic matcha farming. I think it might have been the second episode they ever did, where Ian from Unomi was invited to talk. And he was saying that when you transition a non-organic garden into an organic garden for tencha/matcha production, those a lot of the tea plants die, and two, the ones that do live are very sick and have almost no yield for a very long time, and
Yeah.
it takes years before you can harvest them
It's like
because they're like drug addicts.
almost they need to go through a
Yeah,
detox.
they're going through a withdrawal. So anyway, it's a a long
Well,
rant.
we don't want to sound like some sort of eco-maniac that care about, like these plants are suffering. But in a way, they are suffering, right? Like, but also at the same time, like shading technology is really the very reason why matcha tastes like matcha. If you don't shade matcha or the tea bush, it's not going to taste like matcha at all. So there is a fine balance, I would say, between how do you shade and how you grow it and how you treat matcha as a plant and as a living thing.
Yeah. From an environmental perspective, it's kind of disastrous. You need to use tons of fertilizer. And because you use tons of fertilizer, you need tons of pesticides in this very high intervention process of making tea. So you can criticize it with that lens if that's what you care about more. But if you care about human health, outside of the negative externalities of like the nitrogen and the waste, the runoff that's produced from that type of agriculture, let's say you don't live in Japan, those environmental factors don't affect you, at least not immediately. But you care about health, right? You don't get those levels of L-theanine. You don't get those extremely high levels of EGCG. So you're now producing tea leaves, even from an exhausted plant. You're producing tea leaves that are way more nutritious than before it went through that process. So if you care about nutrition first, who cares about that other stuff? We're now getting something that's very good for human health. Actually, the Global Japanese Tea Association does a conference every year. They do one in Tokyo, one in Kyoto, and it's fantastic content, by the way. And they invite 3 keynote speakers. They each have about a half-hour talk that's consecutively translated between Japanese and English. And one of them was actually exactly on this topic, was over fertilization and all this nitrogen. And something that Ian also from Unomi talks about a lot is like the pesticide residue requirements in Japan are some of it's very well regulated, but they're very not conservative with the amount of legal pesticides allowed. Actually, especially some of the like ridiculous fruits, like if you ever hear about like a $200 melon made in Japan, those are all hyper pesticide, very heavy use of pesticide. My girlfriend went to agricultural school in France, but she did a year of study in Tokyo, an agricultural food/food program there, and learned all about this. And she was horrified. Like someone coming from France in the EU, where there's really strict rules around residue requirements, he was horrified to learn that. And in Taiwan and in mainland China, all very relaxed places in general in terms of like legal requirements. And apparently, a lot of some of Japan's best tea, like apparently Suji-san's tea, is not EU compliant. So everything that's coming in is coming in very small quantities.
Yeah.
And all of the large houses, like Marukyu, basically have two separate arms and two separate production. One that's EU and European compliant, and one for domestic consumption and for the rest of the world.
This whole EU policy has really did something good to the environment as a whole. Farmers and all of these manufacturers trying to be EU compliant, they are using less pesticides. So you see that happening in Japan, you see that happening in China too. Like in order to meet the EU standard, the local government are incentivizing farmers to use less pesticides and less fertilizers in order to meet the exportation requirement. And you see some really heavy-handed policy being applied in some area in Japan and China too.
Well, isn't that ironic of us to say?
Yeah.
The two people who really hate on organic matcha, because from a product perspective, it tastes worse.
It does taste worse.
So, we're all kind of hypocrites in this way. And that's where
Yeah.
all of this conflict comes from. Because you and I could get into a legitimate argument right now about this. And like we would both kind of be right. We're just stack ranking and prioritizing different things.
Yeah.
If I'm advocating for the consumer and a specialty product with interesting flavors coming from all of this process and nature and the things that go on to bring matcha to life, and organic almost always means lower quality. And at the same time, right, it's having all of these other positive externalities. And I'm sure there's secondary and tertiary effects to both of these arguments as well. Like the reality is that reality is complicated. And so is the matcha industry. And people get so easily offended, especially online. And we think they're literally talking past each other because they care about different things. We cannot say that we care about the consumer, matcha businesses, the product, the matcha farmers, ceremony and culture, health and wellness, and environmental, all at the same
Equally,
level.
at the same time. That's just not possible, or
Yep.
not possible for now, because consumer preference is going to change too, Ryan. Like in the future,
Yeah.
like people nowadays care about certain things, and the only way to achieve those sweetness, those umami bond, is not using sustainable ways of farming. But people's preference might change in the future for more bitter, more pungent flavor coming up from tea plants. Might be a trend into the future. We don't know.
Yep.
And for that to happen, like naturally, you don't need to use over fertilization or over pesticides. And if there is a future that all of these things that people care about might converge.
Yeah, very possible. Consumers aren't a monolith either. You have very experienced consumers with tons of context that value different things, than people who have a little context just looking for a quote unquote ceremonial grade product. And you have people that don't even know what matcha is, right? Consumers aren't a monolith. And by the way, neither are tea farmers. Also not a monolith. It's, you got like really successful rock star farmers winning competitions against like grandma and grandpa who have no retirement plan, who don't know what to do with this farm. There's like thousands of these people, and end up making some sort of deal or just abandoning it altogether because there's no succession plan. And then you have like gigantic businesses who are doing mass scale agriculture to make tons and literally many, many metric tons of matcha a year. And they're very different people. And by the way, so is ceremony and culture. Everyone talks about, like when we were being accused of slandering tea ceremony and tea culture, I recently was reading a book that I think I've talked about before called Making Tea, Making Japan. And it's kind of the history of tea ceremony in Japan and how it's been shaped over the years. And I didn't realize that I was putting Urasenke, Amotosenke, and Senrikyu up on this giant pedestal. And it actually turns out that the Sensenke, these three schools that all descended from Senrikyu, actually like waxed and waned in prominence over the years. So not only were there tons of other samurai schools, but at some point they were kind of very marginalized and had very little influence. And there's some very interesting maneuverings that they did to regain power. So the ceremonial institutions and schools are not a monolith either. And reading this book was very illuminating. Like Hideyoshi and the way that he was doing tea at the time, and like all of these other warlords, it was almost a big show and tell. Like you took
Mm,
all the expensive stuff that you got from China, mostly, all these expensive ceramic, and were showing it off. And even this, like the Meiji era, when all of the barons, like the oil barons, the steel barons, the textile barons, as Japan was undergoing massive industrialization. They weren't necessarily attached to the tea ceremony schools either. And they were hosting their own tea gatherings, kind of doing it their own way, which were also some kind of big show off of wealth and cultural capital, and to build some social capital and to do networking, and had really nothing to do with the philosophical underpinnings that we all think of as tea ceremony.
and
And
this was when?
Meiji.
Meiji. So very
Yeah.
recently,
Yeah,
actually.
150 years ago,
Yeah.
like in the 1800s, when Japan was going under this rapid industrialization.
Mhm.
And actually, it turns out also during this period, I think that Urasenke wanted to get much closer to the emperor and to be have much greater proximity and cultural relevance there. And they quote unquote rediscovered some ancient temai or practice that Senyo Rikyu did in their documents.
That's very timely.
Very, very convenient. There was it was any criticism of this was implicit in the book, but they left room for interpretation that it was very convenient timing because the book was also written by an Urasenke student, so I'm sure she had a very difficult time threading that needle, both being historically accurate and being a member of this institution. But I mean, these institutions are not perfect, and a lot of valid criticism around sexism, especially. I mean, they like flat out like Urasenke, Amotosenke, and a lot of these schools are sexist. As a woman, you have an absolute ceiling where you cannot raise past certain levels. Some of the most advanced temai and the most advanced teachings are all reserved at the top for men. And at the very highest level, the Iamoto system has actually been criticized as one of the last vestiges of feudalism in Japan.
Yeah,
Um,
patriarchy at its finest.
right? It's really what Warren Buffett would call the divine right of the womb. The only way that you're able to get that is to be born in and to inherit this position, which is an interesting cultural legacy, but it's far from egalitarian or meritocratic or fair. If your life goal and passion is chanayu, as a woman to progress, it's absolutely a ceiling. And most of the reason why women are encouraged in Japan to study tea ceremony is basically to become, quote, good wives and wise mothers. This was actually a policy, very famous policy, which started about 100 years ago. And that's basically the reason why Urasenke is so prevalent everywhere today, is because it had a whole new influx of young girls where this was basically finishing school, which became the current practitioner.
Yeah, basically trad wife readiness schools.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
It's a very different type of culture, and that still lives on today. We actually recently got a message from someone who's Japanese and kind of like doesn't love the traditional aspects of Japanese culture. And he was like, "Yeah, I thought like tea ceremony was for women. If you spend any time in Japan, it's very easy to get this impression."
Yeah,
Uh,
very stereotypical.
yeah, but it's also not a monolith too. I mean, there's other schools and samurai schools, and actually, to be honest, I don't know very much about them or their philosophical underpinnings, but they might be very different.
It's really weird to me, honestly. Like, it's a thing for women, but the leader can only be male.
And the
It's,
top leadership can only be male.
yeah, it's
And
really weird.
and weirdly enough, the Iamoto himself does almost no teaching. It's all the direct level underneath him that have the direct interactions with the students. And it turns out too that you can accelerate your licensure within Urasenke. I've learned within this book is that if you are a person of prominence, let's say you're a director of a museum or something, the Iamoto can bestow upon you certain licenses, and you can sort of accelerate what would normally take someone 20 years or 30 years to achieve, but it's actually really interesting maneuvering to make sure that these institutions remain culturally relevant because you're connected and have influence over all of these other people with both hard and soft power within societies. So it's
Wow,
actually, if you
very
think about it
interesting.
from an institutional preservation
Very smart.
perspective, incredibly smart.
Very smart.
And no
It's
one talks about it.
just like the Jesuit church
In Dune,
in Dune.
yes,
It's like
it's,
exerting power with the names of culture
yeah.
and religion. It's,
So these places are very far from pure. And now I am talking from the perspective of a consumer and someone who loves this product, and not as a member of these institutions, right?
Mm.
But like, if I really care about like keeping it pure in a ceremonial perspective, of course I wouldn't talk about this argument. And I'm sure maybe we'll receive some hate mail for talking about this. But anyone listening, I really highly recommend the book Making Tea Making Japan. It really broke down a lot of assumptions that I had about the evolution of tea ceremony and how it's not a monolith
Yeah.
either.
And on the other hand, really makes us become more understandable of why certain people got triggered so much when we talk or sometimes criticize Japanese tea ceremony.
Oh yeah, that's actually
Because
the reason why I've read this book.
it's so intertwined with the Japanese-ness, the Japanese identity, and the Japanese as a nation, that when you are trying to make any criticisms of any of its cultural elements, a lot of people will naturally think that you are attacking this whole idea, this whole community as a whole, which is understandable.
Yeah. And the Japanese government has put in tons of policies to select Chanayu and tea ceremony as the embodiment of Japaneseness. And that was not only done with the modern government, but also with eras before this in the Meiji and Edo as well.
Compared to the length of tea and tea culture, this is really nothing.
Yeah.
There's
And there's
nothing traditional about it.
And very weirdly, too, if you look at the histories of these institutions, like if you read the history books that are closely associated with Urasenke, for example, you basically learn about Senrikyu, Hideyoshi. Anyone who's taken tea ceremony lessons have certainly heard these names. And it's kind of the great man theory of history. And there's remarkably little accounting for of everything after Rikyu. And a lot of scholars are speculating that even Rikyu and during Rikyu's time, and he was pooling a lot of philosophy from a lot of other places, and that like there were a lot of other voices and perspectives that have contributed to what is this actually a very beautiful art of Chanoyu into nowadays, but it's been kind of reduced down to this great man theory of history that's easy to explain and to have a narrative around. Because when you actually learn Japanese tea ceremony lessons as a student, the way the school is structured, is it's kind of an oral tradition. It used to be, it used to be. I think there's exceptions now, but I remember being told by my instructors that you're not allowed to take notes during the lessons.
Mm.
So it's a completely experiential type learning. I mean, typically you're not allowed to ask questions. And I remember her telling me she would go to lessons, she would really try to remember and repeat the steps over and the corrections that the teacher were making over and over in her head. And on the subway ride home, she would like be jotting down notes endlessly to then study because she wasn't
uh,
allowed to take them during the lessons.
Zen Buddhism kind of
Y-
practice.
Yes, extremely Zen, very not direct learning, much
Mm.
more experiential. You have to live it. And when you have many instructors all over the world in different languages, and or even before it spread internationally, you need to have easy to remember stories and narrative to tell your students. And it's actually something that we all kind of share. Anyone who's been through this training kind of is one big family. We all sort of have heard the same stories and philosophies, and it's actually a very beautiful thing. And something that was written in this book, Making Tea Making Japan, is that if you compare it to other institutions, Chanayu has, even with all of this drama that we're talking about, negative externalities, has done remarkably little harm that you can directly point to. It's largely benefited Japanese society and is actually relatively innocent. So when we're criticizing it, we're very much criticizing it through the lens of the consumer. But we bounce back and forth. We've talked to tea ceremony practitioners on this podcast and really respect it and want to learn more about it. Actually, the single greatest barrier for promoting matcha as a specialty product is all of this quote unquote cultural baggage, which isn't cultural baggage at all. It's like a lot of like Japanese-ness in its philosophies and its aesthetics, etc. And you cannot understand how matcha can evolve in the future without deeply understanding its past and understanding where all of this inertia comes from and why it exists. Like, no one wants to be the idiot in the room stumbling around with no context. So actually, in the season 3 of this podcast, we want to do a lot more learning, going back in time through Chanayu history and tea history in Japan, but to better contextualize how the future can be made and to better understand why some of these barriers exist. Where do these poetic names come from? Where do these institutions come from? Where do all of these beliefs come from?
But calling it a baggage or calling it inertia, I think it's very context specific. It's a inertia when we are viewing matcha in the lens of a specialty product. It's all of these cultural context is essentially really inhibiting matcha being enjoyed and consumed as a specialty product in a lot of ways. But it's not a inertia or a baggage as a Japanese cultural element. Like it will exist and it will continue to exist. I hope it will continue to exist into the future and make more people enjoy and be curious about Japanese culture as a whole.
Yeah. And it can swing back. That's the second order effect. So, really, a lot of these things can be true at the same time, depending on whether or not you look at it. As a company and as a podcast and as a specialty movement, we deeply care about the product quality itself and the consumer. And we're putting that before history and culture, at least in a primary sense of the word. All of these institutions and a lot of companies are doing great work spreading the direct culture itself. If you're interested in culture, go enroll yourself into a tea ceremony school. Right? But for everyone else, there's this huge vacuum which the specialty movement can fill and grow and ultimately swing back to these other people. And we think all of this online negativity and conflict comes from this misalignment, and people do not recognize that people are operating and prioritizing and optimizing for very different sets of contexts, ranging from the consumer to being a small matcha business somewhere in the supply chain,
The farmer.
the farmer, big, small, medium, old, retiring one that has no succession plan, or the product itself and product quality, the ceremony and culture, or the health and wellness aspects of it, or the environment. And that these things can both contradict each other or reinforce each other. And when you put on the lens of time and cause and effect, maybe it's temporarily negative, but could then be very positive.
Yep. And they will be forever intertwined with each other and they might converge or diverge and hopefully converge again into the
Yeah. So, what do you care about? That's the that's a fine conclusion.
I care about getting over from this podcast recording and get some dinner. Hungry.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So, if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider sharing with a friend, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you.
Thanks.